Okay, so we're gonna shift gears and kind of move on to discussing a time period as we move away from the revolutionary generation, maybe we'll call it that, and we start coming into finding politicians and other figures that um, were not the central. They were not playing a central role in what we would call as founders, although they were, of course, people from that time period and generation. Um, but I just thought it would be good to do a little bit of a recap on some of what we have been seeing in the presidency. Um, George Washington, of course, really just set the stage for kind of an expectation of the role of the president in many regards, although he did things that no other president has, like such as leading a standing army to squash a rebellion of people who don't want to pay taxes. No one's ever did that thus far, anything close to it. But we have been seeing the kind of tensions in the ways of visions of America, right? So I often would talk about George Washington's more strong federal government kind of view, and then we just covered Jefferson's more um, agricultural, decentralized view of America. And we saw things get complicated under the presidency of Madison. Well, let me back up for a second and say, let's not forget that as Jefferson finished up being president, things were not going well for him. And Jefferson actually was quite bitter about his life as president, maybe one of the least favorite things that he participated in. On his tombstone, I believe he didn't even leave that as one of his legacies. To give you an idea about how he felt, how that was going, and part of it was a lot to deal with also the international situation. So when Monroe becomes, when Madison becomes president, cannot articulate myself right now very well. All right, so Madison as president, his presidency gets mired in this tension that was going on overseas and the issue of whether or not to declare war on Britain, right? And this is not something he really wanted to participate in. And once that happened, America really was defeated. Of course, ended up in a better position than maybe many would have thought. And of course, they were going up against some great odds. But I mean, he had to be that president who fled the White House watching it burn down. And it's to his wife's credit, she saved this one portrait of Washington. But that's a very humiliating, place to be in as a leader of any nation. And that was a kind of a rough thing for him. So, but coming out of this, I think that what America really had though was a sense of, especially coming out after the War of 1812, is not only a greater sense of itself, but in a certain sense, it was the wake-up call that the United States had about itself in regards to the world. If it's fair to say that the British underestimated the lives of people overseas in their colonies because they were at a distance, and that our war of independence kind of threw them off, right? I think that the leaders of the United States and many people here, I think, really felt a certain kind of isolation, or like we do now, right? Americans are the most. I mean, we are extremely isolated because we have a lot of space, and we deal with the people on our borders. Now we barely even do that, especially if you move up further north. By Canada, Canadians and Americans almost think of themselves as the same. Well, Americans think of Canadians almost as the same, I should argue, not the other way around. But, so this is like what I'm saying is that it was made clear. I mean, when you look at Jefferson's foreign policy idea and the way he reduced the Navy and so forth, there was a vision of just not being a part of international politics. But when it came to trade and what happens to merchant ships and what's going to, you couldn't escape it. And so here is this kind of a new sense that Americans would have of themselves, and saying, okay, we got to actually take the world serious a little bit, at least for the political leaders. Okay, so I just wanted to mention that. So we're going to be then sliding into the presidency of Monroe. But first I want to talk about a few other things. So despite regional conflicts of interest in America, nationalism vigorously emerged. And, in a sense, we're kind of like that still to this day, right? People in California fled Oregon. Local Oregonians find that really annoying. They don't like Californians sometimes. You have Southerners annoyed with the way that people of the North think of them, and vice versa. So we still to this day have this kind of thing. But at the end of the day, even now, we do have quite a strong American nationalism, at least in certain pockets. And they're usually, most of the people who don't think of us having a lot of nationalism are very nationalistic themselves. They want more of it, right? Okay, so all right, now we had the memory of the revolution now. We start seeing the veneration of the Constitution. Now the Constitution is actually, working itself out. What they always say is the proof's in the pudding, as the saying goes. Okay, before you had a kind of theoretical framework, then we're going to say, okay, we're going to implement this. Now what is it going to look like? All right, and so it was working. And, we had this idea of these founding fathers because, again, if the United States would have just started falling completely apart, then people would look at it differently. But, when things work, people take note. And when they don't, they also take note, right? And so I think we start seeing a kind of confidence building. And then there's this idea, which is now more controversial to us in modern times, is this kind of manifest destiny. And we'll talk about it again because it's just going to keep being a part of our discussion that really holds over even until now, which is that we're kind of like God's chosen people. I mean, if you read the Old Testament, you have a story of Jews in bondage in an ancient, in a faraway land of Egypt in the story. And then they are freed by God with a noble leader, okay, Moses. They are parted through a Red Sea. The enemies are crushed from behind, and they go through a desert, and they come to this beautiful land of Canaan. And that's called the Promised Land, the land that God promises the people to have, flowing full of milk and honey. But there's one problem in the story that kind of hits at the wall of modern sense of ethics. The land was full of people. Now, in the biblical story, God said that those people are so terrible and corrupt that the once oppressed Jews are actually to annihilate even the children, even the infants. It says it in the Bible. I'm not editorializing at all. To kill off that population that are no longer worthy of the land, and that they are to transform it into the land that will become Israel, ancient Israel. And that was controversial, actually, even discussed by some of the rabbis in their discourse. Now, the reason why I went into the detail of that, because remember, we're talking about where we were a religious nation. And that notion of God giving land over to a chosen people at the expense of people who are not worthy of it due to immoral practices. The Native Americans were seen as such people. They were pagan. They seemed to have no sense of family in the way that the white European settlers saw it, and they had no sense of civilization. And I think you could argue that it had a very strong parallel feel, of many of the oppressed or some of the downtrodden coming in from Europe onto this chosen land, and that you have Native Americans being somewhat modern Canaanites. Okay, and we can explore that more later, but I just kind of wanted to talk about that and kind of wrap your mind around that for a moment. And then we'll move on to the next section where I'm going to talk about into the mythic, again, where we're heading post-Founding Father era.